found out I was going to be ministering here just shortly ago, very shortly ago. So we're going to see how this works. Brother Blake offered to play a video of Brother Moore and let me lip sync, which would have been far better than what I've prepared. But you're going to have to live with me for tonight. John, remind me to write you the check after church. I appreciate the build-up, man. Thank you. On a serious note, you know, I've known John for, Lord, almost 10 years now. And I've watched you since you first came to this church. And I watched you grow into the ministry and lead services and teach and do all these things. I'm going to tell you something. This young man right here, and I call him young because I'm an old, he has come so far and grown so much. You are an incredible man, and I look forward to the next 10 years or so, seeing what God has in store for you. If you will, turn with me to 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 7 through 11. I'm going to read there. Again, thank you very much for your kindness and allowing me to be part of this church family and tolerating me. I have kind of a special thing tonight. You know, I was going through my dad's stuff today, and I found his watch. I can't tell you how many times as a kid I would pick Dad's watch up and I'd try it on, and it was always too big for me. Well, I picked it up today, and I noticed it was still keeping good time. So I opened it up and I put it on my wrist. And you know, it fit for the first time in my life. I don't know if that means that Dad shrank or I got fat or what, but it fit. And as I looked at it, I realized, Dads, you got kids that are walking behind you that are going to try on your time for themselves. And one day, they're going to step into your place and into your time. The greatest gift you can give your children is making sure that when they get there, it fits. I love you, Dad, and miss you. You know, my dad always kind of, when I went a little bit long, so in honor of him, I'm taking his watch, I'm putting it on the pulpit, and I'm going to ignore it just like I always have. So, praise God. Sorry to be melancholy, but there are days. And Dad would have laughed at that and then beat me when I got home. You never get too old. 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 7 through 11. Peter says this. He says, "But the end of all things is at hand. Be you therefore sober, and watch unto prayer. Above all things have fervent charity among yourselves, for charity shall cover the multitude of sins. Use hospitality one to another without grudging. As every man hath received a gift, even so minister the same one to another, as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. If any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. If any man minister, let him do it as the ability which God giveth, that God in all things may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom be praise and dominion forever and ever. Amen." The Lord bless you. You may be seated. I'm going to talk just a few minutes about a subject that I kind of feel is cogent to the day. I want to talk about love covers. Love covers. It's a day that we feel is unique, and perhaps it is in the history of the United States. I hope these are mine. If not, don't tell me. If you drank out of it, don't tell me. Please don't. Just let me be blissfully unaware and hydrated. Maybe. There we go. My grace is not sufficient, although his is. But we feel that it is a day that is unique, and perhaps it is in our history, but not in the history of mankind. We live in a day when great change is in the air, whether for good or for evil, whether for something we want or something we don't want. We don't know yet. We can't see the future. We don't know what God has planned, and we don't know how man is going to behave himself or what he's going to do. But we do know that our day is quite like the day that Peter lived in. The apostle is writing to the church, and he's speaking to the churches in Asia Minor, both Jew and Gentile, who in their day lived in a time that was politically and culturally similar to what we have here. It was a very prosperous time. It was a time when great metropolitan areas had sprung up. There was a protected sense about the people. They feared not much. The government was strong. But there was a day also that they had become entitled. They felt they deserved all the good things that were in their area. Even in times of famine and times of drought, they ate well in Asia Minor because it was the great crossroads of the world. The trade routes between Egypt and Europe, the trade routes between India and Persia and the rest of the world. All the world's wealth flowed through Asia Minor. And they enjoyed this great prosperity. But they also, like us, and we do the same, had become a center of carnality and idolatry. Jesus spoke of worshiping two masters. He said you can either serve one or the other. He said you can serve God or you can serve mammon. You can serve the Lord or you can serve your own carnal flesh. And truly that's what mammon is. We define it as wealth in some ways, but it's more than that. It is a worship of the pleasures of the flesh. It is a worship of wealth and entertainment. It is that place where the great sporting arenas had sprung up across Asia Minor. There was no city that was of any account that did not have great temples built in it and great sporting arenas where they would have the gladiatorial games and the races. As a matter of fact, at one time in the city of Rome and in the city of Alexandria, likewise, and some of the cities in Asia Minor, they had problems with roving gangs of hooligans, the Reds and the Greens, or the Blues and the Greens, I believe it was, that would actually come to blows in the streets over who had won the chariot races. There was a great turmoil over this worship of entertainment that had come into it. Some of the wealthiest and the greatest, most celebrated people were not those artists and people who had contributed to society, but rather gladiators and racers and wrestlers and people that had entertained the masses. They worshiped money and wealth. Like I said, they were a great trade center. It was where money became more important than family. It became more important than their own morals or their own souls. Everything they did centered somehow around mammon. It was manifest in their desire for power over others. The political maneuverings that were evident in that part of the world would be unequaled until the great Venetian wars 1,000 years later. It was an incredible time, and it was a time much like ours. One of the hallmarks of their society at this time was their focus on two things: violence and physical relationships. And I say that being circumspect about what I speak of. But they're, like our media today, the two things it sells are violence and personal relationships, physical relationships. They focused on this so much that they had lost their direction and their way. They had become a people who had lost their faith and lost their morality. They had become so decadent that everything was a race to the bottom. It was a time when they searched for some new thing. Paul encountered it on Mars Hill when he walked into the temple district, and they said, we've come here to find some new thing, and we found someone who preaches a doctrine that's different than ours. Come and hear him. Come and hear him. It was a hunger for some new thing. That empty place in mankind had become dominant in their lives. They wanted something to fill that lost place, that empty place that only God can fill. But they had become so decadent and so far from God that they could not see Him. The conditions of that day were ripe and perfected for revival. The Bible says that when darkness is great, the light and the grace is so much greater. The one constant of that day was every man for himself. And as it pleases you, so do. When we look at all of these things and we turn and we look at our culture here in the American church, we find ourselves rich and filled with goods. We find our hands full, but at times we find our hearts empty. We're surrounded by the blessings of the world. And you know, I'm kind of glad. I don't really want to live in a place in the world where there aren't things like drive-thrus and air conditioning and running water. I've got no desire to go back to that. The good old days ain't quite so good. But I also recognize the dangers and the prosperity of our day. Because when you become so prosperous that you no longer have to strain to survive, you lose that dynamic of a purpose in your life, and you lose that dependency on an outside agency to help you from day to day. These people in the book of 2 Peter, in this letter that Peter wrote to this church, were experiencing this very thing, just as we are today. The Bible speaks of a generation who's thankless. Does that not describe our generation anymore? Who's angry, who's quick to shed innocent blood. At one time, I can remember as a child, when someone would fall and hurt or be assaulted, people would run to help. But now they pull out their little phones and they run to film it so they can put it on Facebook or Twitter or whatever the latest social media thing is, and garner to themselves some attention for themselves because they filmed that. They don't bother to help, but they're swift to the shedding of innocent blood. It's a time when media has taken so much of our personality and so much of what we are and molded us into a generation that has forgotten the basic morality of humanity. We've forgotten as a society, not so much the church, but as society in general, we've forgotten that man is made in the image of God, and that there should be that about us that is hesitant to lay their hands on that image. Some things are sacred. Some things shouldn't be touched. How can you love God and hate the man who's made in the image of God? You see, when you live in this world, you find yourself in a place where you have to guard against the infiltration of these things into the church. as the world goes, so the church goes, is one of the things I've heard said. I'm not sure I believe it 100%, but I do see that society, in all its pressures and in all our lives and in all the things that we deal with, does infiltrate and slide its way into the church. I think that we have, in our gaining of so much, have lost a few things. Peter looked at these churches and he began to tell them that you've got to guard yourself against these things that come into the church. And then he began to explain to them, here's the things you have to be careful of. Here's what you have to guard against. Here's what you have to hold on to, where the walls should be built to keep the barbarians beyond the gate. He talked about holiness and purity of life. He talked about submission. Ooh, Lord have mercy, that's a big one today. We Americans have had no king and will have none until we do. And then he'll kill half of us trying to be king. Isn't that about the way it is? Americans don't do submission very well. We do not give ourselves up. We are independent, fiercely so sometimes to our own detriment. He talked about being stewards of grace and about relationships. And especially he talked about our responsibility one to another. He talked about guarding one another in this time and defending each other against the spirit of the age. And let me say this. There's an axiom that no soldiers, no group of soldiers is ever outnumbered by a group of individual warriors. Why? Because they work together. Why could the legions of Rome conquer most of the known world? When they were outnumbered, the enemy at times had superior arms, were better supplied, and stronger warriors. Because the emphasis of the legion was teamwork, was working together. Their armor was designed for them to defend each other. Their shield was designed to defend the man next to them. Their weapons were designed so that you could defend the man next to you, because you knew that on each side of you was someone who was going to be standing beside you, defending you also. That's the way the church ought to be. We ought not have to worry about defending ourselves, because we ought to know that our brothers and our sisters defend us also. We shouldn't have to worry about watching our backs, because we know that our brethren have our backs. We should work together as one, so much the more so in this day when, like Peter said, it's the end of days. So much more should we work together and guard each other against the things and the infiltration of this world. Well, how do we do that? Let's go back and look at verse 7. Do you mind putting this up? Now, I'm going to kind of walk through, so just be prepared. He begins in verse 7. He says, "But the end of all things is at hand. Be ye therefore sober and watch unto prayer." The end of all things. We look at that, and it's a very dramatic statement. We would almost say hyperbole. But within a couple of lifetimes, within a generation of this day, the Goths and the Visigoths and different barbarian tribes swept through and destroyed their way of life. Was he being dramatic? Or was he simply recognizing the truth of the times? When a nation comes to a place where it's so occupied with its own pleasure that it refuses to defend its own people, sooner or later someone's going to take advantage of it. And we're in that place. And we live in this nation. It behooves us to recognize where we are and to prepare to defend each other and ourselves against the intrusion of this world. While we live in this day, grace gives us time. Our day is like theirs. Every imagination is given over to evil. It's always something new. I happened to read a news article today that there's a show on Netflix. And I don't have Netflix. Haven't had for quite a while. I had it briefly, and I'm like, no, there's just nothing on here for me. I don't appreciate this. If you do, that's up to you. You work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And that made me afraid, so I trembled and cut it off and went my own way. But I read an indictment where the state of Texas is pressing criminal charges against this company for lewd and lascivious display of children in public. And they're not apologetic about it. They double down on their statement and stand by it. Every imagination has become evil. It seems like we live in a day when somebody's always trying to get a little worse than the last guy, to do a little worse than the next one. And we have to guard against these things coming in. Not only that, but nobody's concerned. People are frightened. I saw a little meme. It was about people are frightened about COVID, so they wear a mask. But nobody's afraid of going to hell anymore. Well, I assure you, heaven is real, and I intend to go there. And hell is just as real, and I intend not to go there. I have no desire to go there. If you wish to go there, you won't see me. Bon voyage. Have a nice trip. I'm not going. I intend to go elsewhere. But nobody cares anymore. It's not that people don't believe it. It's they just never think about it. It never crosses their mind. It's not part of their consciousness. They're so absorbed in this carnal world around them that they've forgotten that there's more, that there's something besides what's in their hands and on their plate. Verse 7 says you've got to guard against these things. And Peter begins to talk and he says, be ye therefore sober. Now, we use the word sober to mean unintoxicated, not being drunk, not being high. And it does mean that. But it also means be serious about things. Watch things. Be careful about what you do and where you go. Guard your mind and your thoughts and your attitudes. Don't allow the thoughts and the attitudes of the world to infiltrate your way of thinking. You know what the great danger of media is? The great danger of television and the movies and the radio shows and all of these displays is. You know what the great danger is? It's not in the individual sins you see, although you stain your soul with those. It changes your way of thinking. What you entertain yourself with is what your attitudes and your way of thinking becomes. You think about it. What's in your subconscious today will be in your conscious mind tomorrow. If you fill your eyes and your heart full of ungodly things, when you come into the presence of God, You will be unable to reach out to Him because those things will have changed your way of thinking and approaching Him so much that the carnal flesh will occlude the glory of God. Demas hath forsaken me for the cares of this world. It's not just us. It's not just me. It's all of us. There are certain things we're vulnerable to. Be of a sober mind. Be careful what you put in your mind. The eyes are the gateway to the soul. What you look at is what you will become. What was it David said? I will set no evil thing before mine eyes. Why? Because I don't want to become those evil things. Be ye therefore sober. Be careful. And watch unto prayer. Now that's an interesting phrase. It's a little bit archaic in our terminology and the way we do. It literally means, in the Old English, to be watchful, to be a watchman, to be guarding, to be vigilant, to be ever on your guard against things, not sleeping. Be vigilant in prayer. Be ever praying. As Paul said, praying always with all prayer. If you want to survive this day and you want to walk through this thing and make it through these times with a clean heart and soul, you're going to have to pray. You can't do this without developing a prayer life. And you're going to have to pray more than the 5 minutes we do before church and the few minutes we do in the altar. You're going to have to develop a prayer life at home, in the car, at work, everywhere you go. Your prayer life should go with you. And not just the effects of it, but your prayer life itself. It is your connection with God that empowers you to overcome the world. Don't be slack in prayer. Then verse 8. He says, these things you've got to do. These are powerful things. These are a guideline and the base to start. He says this in verse 8, though. He says, and above all things. He said first, foremost, and last. Above those. He said, you got to do these. But there's something else you're going to have to do in these times. Above all things, have fervent charity among yourselves, for charity shall cover the multitude of sins. The word Greek for charity is agape. We translate it also today as love. And above all things, have fervent love among yourselves, for love shall cover the multitude of sins. Let's talk about that for a minute. Love covers a multitude of sins. It covers up, it hides things. Now, we don't mean that in a way like condoning sin. You know, being a minister, I am required by law that if I see certain things happen, I have to report it. I may love that person, but I'm still required to report it. I can't cover it up. There are things that love doesn't cover up. But I'll tell you what love does. Love looks at a person with all their flaws and all their warts and all their problems and their sorrows and their brokenness, and it just covers it up and says, I love you anyway. That's what love does. I look at my kids. My kids aren't perfect. They're great young men. I love all three of them with all my heart and soul. But I have to admit, there are some flaws there. Mostly because they're related to me. Hey, you know, you got to be honest about this. I know me, and I look at my son, and I go, oh, Lord, I'm so sorry. I'm paying for my childhood. 3 times over, I'm paying for my childhood. But I love my sons. And my love covers their failings, their flaws. My love covers their problems. That word for sins is hamartia. It literally means to be without shame in. It means to do things and not be ashamed of it. I sat in a restaurant a couple of mornings ago, meeting with another minister, and my son was in there. And there were two gentlemen, older gentlemen, sitting over in a corner. And they had the most vile, filthy language I've heard in a long time. And up until just a week ago, I worked with truckers and mechanics. Okay, so you figure what was going on over the corner. They're just vile. Women, children, police officers. And they're just loud and completely oblivious. No shame. No shame at all. No shame. That's what sin means. It means to miss the mark, to make a mistake, or to err. You ever made a mistake? I'll raise my hand. Y'all are perfect. Put your hand down. Put your hand down, John. I know better. Y'all are better than me. I make mistakes all the time. I do dumb stuff. I say dumb stuff. I bumble around. It means to do wrong or go wrong or to violate God's law. You see, nobody in this church is perfect. We all fail. We all fall. We all do things that we shouldn't do. We all have moments of weakness, even the best among us. We all make mistakes. But here's what love does. While love doesn't condone those things, love covers them. If John here got angry, I'm going to use you. You're sitting on the front. Well, you're the victim of the day. I love you. Yeah, but I'm afraid of him. I can outrun you. Well, maybe not, but John gets mad and does something. He goes out and cuts my tire on my truck. We're being silly. Why not? That's pretty much a sin. That's a sin against me, sin against my truck. You mess with my truck, we're going to have problems. Okay? But I love John. While I'm not going to be happy with John, I'm not going to stop being his friend. I'm not going to stop loving him. I'm not going to stop caring about him. Might not stop beating him for a while. But it's all in love. See, love covers. If John got mad and did something that hurt my feelings, I'm going to forgive him. He'll probably never even know it because love covers. If you did something and hurt me by some way, it wouldn't matter because love covers. If I look over there, Brother Foster, and you've been taken in a fault and you've fallen and something happened to you, I'm not going to cover my eyes and turn my back and say, oh, well, not my problem. No. I'm going to walk up and I'm going to put my hand down and I'm going to take you by the arm and I'm going to pick you up. You see, we live in a day when it's every man for himself, and we can't survive that. We live in a day where neighbor is turned against neighbor, and father against son, and mother against daughter. We live in a day where this world wants us at each other's throat constantly. But Peter knew that you can't survive with that attitude in this church. You got to love one another. And you've got to be fervent about it. That means you have to be intentional. You've got to do this on purpose. You can't do this emotionally. You know, love's not an emotion, right? Love's a commitment to treating someone in a certain way. And there's a list of it in 1 Corinthians there about how you ought to treat people. Love is, da-da-da-da-da, and love is not. It's a commitment. Because I assure you, Sister Moore, you love Brother Moore. I know you do. He's still walking. He's alive. He has not received a shank in the kidney. I know you love him. But I promise you, there's been days when you didn't like him quite as much as you did other days. One of the greatest lessons my parents ever taught me is my dad was being a fool. He's dead, I can say that. I'm not afraid of him anymore. Well, maybe I am, but he ain't doing anything about it. I know where he is. He was just being a fool. And my mama turned around and looked at him and says, Dwight, I love you, but I don't like you right now. You'd have thought somebody hit my daddy between the eyes with a hammer. It broke his heart. And Mama just got up and walked out of the room. And my daddy changed some things that day. You see, that's what love is. She may have walked out of the room, but when Dad walked in the other room, Mom still loved him. I may not like what you do, but I love you. And I'll do anything for you. And I'll go to any length to help you. And I will pray for you. And I will be your friend. And I've got your back. And I will believe in you when nobody else does. Brother Moore, if you're watching this, put your fingers in your ears. I'm about to meddle. I've been a pastor. And I've seen people come in and pray through to the Holy Ghost and go right back out the doors. And they'd come back in, and they'd pray through, and go right back out the doors. And they come back in, and they pray through, and it becomes a cycle. Until finally they don't come back through the doors. You know why? Because nobody believes in them. You think about that. Nobody believes they're going to stick. Nobody believes good things about them. Nobody believes in them as a person. Dear God, love covers. And if we can't love each other and we can't cover each other, we're not going to make it. Love covers. When you see that sinner walk through that back door, it may be their 50th time to go to that altar. But when they get up, they ought to know that we believe in them. Because I'll tell you something. There was days when I would have quit this. But I had a few people that were willing to look at me and say, I believe in you. I've been through some hard things the last few years. And James Moore has put his arm around my shoulder and said, I believe in you. And dragged me out of the pits. That's the way we have to be. Love covers. I may not like the way you look today. I may not like the way you smell. I may not like what you're doing. But I love you. And I'm going to cover you in it. I'm going to save you. Verse 9. And I'm very quickly going to wrap up. I know I've gone way over. I can actually see that clock. I resent that so much. Yeah, you laugh, but I resent that. Y'all finally got a clock that I can see. Now I ain't got an excuse. Verse 9. Use hospitality to one another without grudging. You know what other words got hospital in it? Yeah, that's where we get hospitality from. We care for the sick there. You know, it's easy to love somebody when they're standing on their own 2 feet and everything's going great. And, you know, Like John over here. Guy looks good. He's dressed sharp. Got a little smell good juice on him. Girl, you have been good for that young man. I'm just going to tell you straight up. I mean, it's easy to like him. But when he looked like something that's been drugged behind the truck, it ain't quite as easy. You got to be a hospital. And you can't begrudge people because people know. It may not be the brightest thing in the world, but I can tell when I ain't wanted. And I will leave. And most people will too. Verse 10. Stand with me. I'm going to let you go. I've held you hostage long enough. There's a fine line between going over 5 minutes and being in a hostage situation. Thank you for rescuing me. Verse 10. As every man hath received a gift, even to minister the same one to another, as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Brother Moore is fond of talking about the law of the harvest. As you sow, so shall you reap. The seed you put in the ground today is the harvest you will feed off of tomorrow. You see, God has given us many gifts, many things. He's lifted us up from where we were. If you knew what I looked like 25 years ago, you'd never recognize me today. I imagine there's other stories like mine. See, God gave me a gift. He gave me grace. He loved me in spite of myself. As God has given us a gift, so we should be a good steward of that gift. And we should be giving the manifold grace of God to others, to each other, and to reach out beyond this place. There are people that I have relationships with that are just rough. They're hard, they're mean, they're cruel, they're nasty. But I love them. I don't condone it. When they tell their dirty jokes, I wander away. But I always come back, and I've always got a kind word for them. When they need something, I make sure I'm there. When life gets hard, I make sure they know that, hey man, I got you back, and I'm going to be here for you. You see, I want them to see God's grace through me. And when they ask me, how do you do it? It's easy. It's a gift that I was given. Let me show you how to get it. That's how you lead people. You love them. This old book is filled with wisdom. You can trust what it says. And when it says love covers a multitude of sins, it means what it says. This world's harsh, but we can change our world within it. I tell you what, why don't we just find a place for about 5 minutes and rediscover that love for God. Let Him love on you. And then take that love out from the altar and give it to those around you. And then take it out into your place, whether it be a school or a job, and give it to them. Come on down. Just a few minutes. Spend some time with Him. He loves you. This is where it starts. He wants to heal you. He wants to help you. He wants to cover you. He wants to touch your soul because He loves you, church. He wants to cover you.